few winters ago, I had just finalized my divorce about 6 months prior, and I desperately needed a reset. Christina, my girlfriend at the time, suggested we take a trip somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the chaos I had been dealing with. We found a rental on a lake in upstate New York, and I booked it for a week, without much thought. The place was exactly what I needed, a modern yet cozy house right on the lake, surrounded by woods, with only a few other properties nearby. Most of them were empty since it wasn't peak season for lakefront living. I welcomed that, as I wanted to be as far from civilization as possible. The host wouldn't be there, but he provided detailed instructions for finding the keys and some information about the house, typical Airbnb stuff. When we arrived in the morning, we found a small package on the front steps. There was no return address, just a handwritten note that said, "Enjoy your stay. Make sure to stay warm." It was a cute gesture, but inside the package was a tiny box of matches. We assumed it was a welcome gift, a strange one, but harmless. Christina joked about how people in upstate New York can be a bit odd, and we moved on. The next 2 days were perfect. Long hikes through the snow, hot drinks by the fireplace, and total peace and quiet. I should mention that snow had been steadily falling since we arrived. It wasn't quite a blizzard, there wasn't much wind or fog, but the snowfall made the landscape feel untouched and serene. The layout of the house was also noteworthy. The master bedroom, where we slept, was on the second floor. It had large windows overlooking the lake, and the roof, perhaps the windows, was thin enough that we could hear the gentle pattern of snowflakes inside, which added a lovely touch. A skylight allowed us to fall asleep while gazing at the beautiful sky filled with snow. On the third night, sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound. It was barely audible beneath the wind and snow. The storm had intensified, and it felt more like a blizzard outside. As I focused on the noise, I realized it was man-made, almost mechanical, unlike the natural sounds typical of the wilderness. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake up Christina, and made my way across the room. I looked out the window and saw the last thing I expected to see, a snowmobile. It was moving slowly across the ice. I know it's not the most abnormal thing. People drive snowmobiles on frozen lakes all the time, but I was just so confused given how late it was. Like I said, the snow was falling more heavily now, so visibility wasn't great, but I could still make out the shape. The driver was moving cautiously, like they weren't completely sure about the ice, and then they just stopped entirely. I watched as the person climbed off the snowmobile and began waving their hands, appearing to be in distress. It looked like they were shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. To my horror, I realized they were facing our house. Did they know we were here? It seemed impossible, but either way, they looked like they needed help. I quickly woke Christina and explained the situation. After getting dressed, I went downstairs and stepped out onto the deck. It was freezing, even with my layers. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with another surprise. The person on the ice was a woman. I could hear her shouting for help, saying, "Thank God someone's there," and that she had lost her little boy somewhere in the snowstorm. She sounded like she was crying or on the verge of hysteria. There was no question in my mind, I had to help. If a child was out there alone in this weather, they wouldn't last long. I laced up my boots and made my way toward the lake, telling Christina to stay inside. As I got closer, I noticed more details about the woman. She was bundled in a thick fur coat, and her hair was pulled back into a tight braid. The ice was solid. I felt reassured that it would be impossible for her son to have fallen through. As I approached, she began explaining that her son had run away from home and that she was searching for him. That statement gave me pause. I had expected her to say he had fallen off her snowmobile and she hadn't noticed. Then I thought about how absurd that scenario was. How could you not notice your own child falling off? The adrenaline must have clouded my judgment because I hadn't considered that until now. Just as I was about to ask for more details, she said something that made me freeze. She asked if I still had those matches. I could see her smile, and for a moment I was confused. Then it all clicked, the matches from the package on the first day, the note she had left, not our host. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. She demanded my wallet and phone, and I had no choice but to give them to her. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Without another word, she jumped back onto the snowmobile and vanished into the whiteout. As she sped away, I turned and ran back to the house, shouting for Christina to call the police. She was already on the phone. When I finally made it back inside, I locked the doors and paced the room, still trembling. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see that snowmobile return. The police arrived about an hour later, but by then, fresh snowfall had covered any trace the woman had left behind. Christina was frantic, while I felt mostly angry. I had come here for peace. However, there was a glimmer of hope. I couldn't imagine how that woman had managed to get her snowmobile onto the lake, so I expected the police to find it abandoned somewhere. Unfortunately, I was wrong. The police searched the area and found an old boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess was that she had come from there. I was furious and insisted they keep looking, but they told me the same thing I already knew. There wasn't much they could do. Even if she left something behind, they'd never find it in all the snow. With Christina's help, I tried tracking my phone, but by that point, it was already offline. The one good thing that came from the ordeal was that the Airbnb host refunded the entire trip. He sounded genuine on the phone and confirmed that he knew nothing about a welcome package. Still, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. How could that woman have possibly known we'd be staying there? And why go to such elaborate lengths just for a simple robbery? I couldn't shake the feeling that the host had something to do with it, but I had no proof. I brought it up with Airbnb, but they were about as helpful as you'd expect. I've always been a paranoid guy, and for a long time after that, I couldn't help but feel that my ex-wife had something to do with it. It honestly makes me angry to write about this. I can just imagine her stupid face laughing at my expense. I've since come to terms with how likely that possibility is, but the whole thing still doesn't make sense. Even now, I have no idea why someone would go through all that just for a wallet and phone unless they were seriously messed up in the head and derived some sick pleasure from it. My family owns a lake house in Northern California that we visit for a couple of short weeks each year during prime summer weather. It's 2 stories tall with an attic. When my younger sister and I were little, we used to climb into the attic and pretend we were camping with our sleeping bags. We'd even bring our puppy up there. There was one small window in the attic through which we would peer to look down at the lake. We always got a kick out of watching people. As we entered our teenage years, we grew too big for both of us to stay in the attic comfortably, which put an end to our sleeping bag antics. Looking back, it was a little sad, but everyone has to grow up eventually. When our grandparents died, my parents inherited the remainder of their furniture. We had some space to fit the bigger pieces, but the attic ended up stuffed with smaller hand-me-down items my parents didn't have the heart to get rid of, as they were all they had left of my Nana and Pop. It felt bittersweet to put my grandparents' things up there, but it was reassuring to know that little pieces of their most cherished items were still watching over us in a way. That whole period honestly felt like the end of my childhood, and I bet my sister would agree. As we got older, it became harder for my family to make it out to the lake house due to my studies and my parents' work. At best, we could all manage maybe a single week off for a family trip, but nothing beyond that. My parents didn't want to rent it out during the many months we weren't there because they were scared of getting their antiques damaged or stolen by sketchy tenants. So, for most of the year, it was mostly abandoned, only being maintained by the landscapers my parents hired. A few years back, they met a local elderly veteran who was now working as an antique craft restorationist. Eventually, they signed a year-long lease with him, trusting he wouldn't rough up the place. He was a small, disfigured man with white hair and one of those gruff, greasy beards. We all thought he looked a bit bizarre, with a grating, off-putting voice to match. However, my dad bonded with him over his military background, reassuring us that none of us understood what it was like to lay down your life for your country, and that men like him deserved a good deal on a place to stay. We didn't have much say in my dad's decision, but I could tell that this elderly man seriously creeped me out. We were also a bit sour about my dad signing the lease because it meant we wouldn't be able to visit the lake house in the summer. Still, my parents could use the extra cash while putting us through college, so my sister and I eventually got over it. Even though my parents trusted him to keep the place safe, they would periodically check in on him through the landscapers. They wanted to ensure he hadn't fallen or had any issues that went unnoticed. These indirect check-ins seemed like the perfect solution. We stayed out of his way, but still had peace of mind. You might call that a little invasive, but this guy was getting a great deal on the place anyway. An elderly man in his twilight years likely didn't care about occasional questions from the laid-back landscapers. My dad reasoned that his rent at least covered maintenance, and it looked like he had been a decent tenant. That all changed when the maintenance guys reported his predatory behavior to my mom over the phone. They mentioned seeing him sitting oddly on the porch, staring at the children by the lake while they worked on neighboring yards. They had even caught him doing other unsettling things that I don't feel comfortable repeating. My mom, a real saint, absolutely hated the idea of a disfigured old man watching children while living in her beloved lake house. For months, she talked my dad's ear off about it until he couldn't take it anymore. I still remember my mom yelling at him about how irresponsible it was to accommodate a potential predator. My dad finally cracked when the year-long lease was up. He tried to let the man down gently, as he respected him as a veteran. My dad lied, telling him they planned to do some work on the house that would leave him without electricity or plumbing for a few months. The man left without much fuss. My parents assumed he would easily find another place to stay, and my mom urged my dad to stop worrying about him so much. She wanted him out of there as quickly as possible, so we even paid the landscapers a little extra to help him gather his belongings. I was also relieved to see him go. It had always felt strange that someone so odd had almost unlimited access to our house. About a year later, my younger sister graduated college, and my parents took the opportunity to clock in their sick days and fly us out for a summer trip to the lake house. They had recently adopted a black lab mix named Bear, who my sister hadn't met yet, so she was especially thrilled. I'll skip the irrelevant details, but by the time we arrived at the house, the sun had just begun to set. We decided to leave Bear inside while we grabbed dinner in town, as the house wasn't stocked with groceries. Before we left, I noticed Bear was acting strangely. His ears were perked up, and he kept pacing as if he was waiting for something. I figured he was just restless from the long trip and brushed it off. We weren't gone long, just enough time to eat and let the heat die down. However, when we stepped back inside, something felt seriously off. Before I could voice my concerns, I saw Bear sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, panting heavily. My sister screamed, and I realized there was blood smeared on the floor beneath him. My mom immediately pulled out her phone, presumably to call 911, while my dad headed into the kitchen to grab a knife. I followed him, and the two of us cautiously searched the house for the intruder. When we reached the top floor, my dad motioned for me to stop. It took me a moment, but I realized the attic hatch was open. It wasn't wide open, just cracked enough for us to see the faint glow of a flashlight shining down. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was frozen with fear. If it weren't for my dad, I don't know what would have happened. Without hesitation, he yanked the hatch open and started climbing up the ladder. I didn't follow. I was too scared. I listened, expecting to hear some kind of struggle, but no sounds came. Moments later, my dad climbed back down, looking seemingly calm. He whispered to me that it was our old tenant, and I could see he was torn about what to do. My mom eventually ran up the stairs, and when she learned what was happening, she began screaming at the top of her lungs. My dad wanted to let the guy go, but my mom wasn't having it. She had already called the police, so that settled the matter. When the police arrived, they went up to the attic and brought the man down the ladder. He looked like he was in really bad shape, and I could tell my dad felt sympathy for him. The police found our house key on him, which angered my mom because my dad had told her he changed the locks. Fortunately, Bear survived, though he was seriously injured. As terrible as that man's actions were, my dad refused to press charges, regardless of what my mom or sister said to convince him. That led to one of the biggest fights my parents ever had, and I never understood why my dad felt so much sympathy for someone who had literally stabbed his dog. This all happened about a year ago, and we haven't been back to the lake house since. I hate to say it, but this experience seriously tainted my childhood memories of that place. I can't say I want to return anytime soon. Last summer, when I was 20, I had an experience that stuck with me. My name is Kevin, and my friend James comes from a wealthy family. His dad is an IP lawyer who contracts with the US government, and they own numerous properties across the country and even internationally. That's the kind of wealth we're talking about. One of their houses is situated on a relatively large but secluded lake. While it's not too big to see the houses on the opposite side, swimming across would be quite a challenge. James's parents were often absent, giving him unlimited access to the house, which he frequently shared with friends, of course, with their permission. There's something exhilarating about being out on the lake. It feels different from a beach, almost exclusive. I hope to be successful enough to own a place like that one day. The lake is mostly isolated, lined with grand houses that often sit empty. Many are vacation homes for people who rarely use them, which is a shame. However, this meant that James could throw wild parties without worrying about neighbors calling the police. On this particular night, it was just the two of us having a low-key evening. I had recently broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years and was in desperate need of some time with a friend. While we were having a few beers on the dock, I noticed a light flickering across the lake. I can't recall the exact time, but at first I thought it was just the sun reflecting off something. Even when I shifted my head, the light persisted, flashing on and off repeatedly. I pointed it out to James, and we both became intrigued, trying to figure out what it could be. Eventually, we realized the flashing wasn't random. It followed a distinct pattern: 3 short bursts, followed by 3 longer ones, and then 3 short bursts again. I felt a bit foolish for not recognizing it, but James snapped his fingers and said it was Morse code. When I looked at him in disbelief and asked when he'd learned Morse code, he admitted he didn't know it well, but he recognized that 3 short, 3 long, 3 short meant SOS. I called BS and pulled out my phone, but to my surprise, James was actually right. Maybe I'm just not one for obscure knowledge, but I felt a bit foolish for not knowing that. The flashing continued for another minute, following the same pattern, before stopping abruptly. We had been staring at it the whole time, and I didn't know what to think. It could have been a prank, but there was always the chance that someone was genuinely in trouble. James immediately suggested calling the cops, but I reminded him that we'd been drinking and weren't of legal age. I was already dealing with a DUI charge, so the last thing I needed was another run-in with the police. He wasn't happy with that, and I could tell he was conflicted. We struggled to think of a rational explanation. Maybe a kidnapping? We considered that someone might have fallen and needed help, but that didn't make much sense since they could have called the police. Being the adventurous, reckless types we were, we decided it was worth checking out ourselves. If it turned out to be serious, we'd call the police then. We went back inside, and James's brother had a bunch of switchblades lying around. He was kind of an odd kid, so we grabbed a few for peace of mind. James insisted he was fine to drive and suggested we go around the lake to that house, but I wasn't comfortable with that for obvious reasons. He joked about my situation and I laughed it off. If we weren't going to drive, there was really only one option left. We walked back out to the yard and dragged James's dad's kayak into the water. At first, we were laughing and enjoying the adventure, but as we paddled further out, we grew quiet. I think we both realized how reckless this idea was, but neither of us wanted to spoil the fun. The sun had almost set, making it harder to see. It wasn't completely dark, thanks to some lights from the lake houses, but it still felt unsettling. As we got closer, the house came into view. It was large like the others, but clearly not well maintained. The dock was half collapsed. Literally half of it was submerged. The flashing light had also stopped, which didn't bode well. We had planned to tie the kayak to the dock, but that was no longer an option given its instability. Fortunately, the yard wasn't too high above the water, so we beached the kayak instead, careful not to slip on the rocks. The adrenaline was kicking in, and I could see James was feeling it too. We looked up at the house. The light had been coming from the second floor, that much we knew. At that point, James was panicking and insisted we leave and call the police. I reminded him that we would have to kayak all the way back to his house since there was no service on the lake and we needed Wi-Fi. I pointed out that we had explored 1 million abandoned buildings before, and this wasn't too different. He wasn't thrilled with that reasoning, but agreed anyway. Believe me, I know how reckless this was. Everyone I spoke to about this shares the same opinion, but I've never been one to make smart decisions, and neither has James. Instead of walking to the front door, which would have been suicide, we crept around the house until we found an unlocked window. We silently slipped inside. The house was not just abandoned, it was completely stripped. There was no furniture or junk, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The floors and walls were bare. We moved cautiously through the rooms, searching for the stairs. There was no one in sight, and every room was as empty as the first. Eventually, we found the stairs and slowly made our way up. I mentally noted where the window was and walked down a hallway until we reached what I guessed was the room where the light had been coming from. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing. I glanced at James, who nodded, and I carefully pushed the door open. The room was empty except for one thing by the window, an old projector facing outside. Alarm bells went off in my head. This was a trap. James must have realized it too, because I suddenly heard him sprinting back the way we came, not bothering to be quiet. Without a second thought, I turned and followed him. As we raced down the stairs, I heard a door, probably a closet door, swing open from the room I had just left, followed by rapid footsteps. We bolted down the stairs and back through the house to the first window. James jumped through, and I was right behind him. As I climbed through, I heard those footsteps again, pounding down the stairs. I didn't look back. I just made it through the window and ran to catch up with James, who was already at the lake's edge. As I ran to him, I heard him curse and quickly realized why the kayak was gone. I turned and saw a figure running toward us from the side of the house. I could barely process it. He was fast. I couldn't see him clearly, but he was definitely an adult. I pulled out my switchblade, ready to defend myself. I expected James to do the same, but instead he jumped straight into the lake, sneakers, hoodie, everything. Without thinking, I followed. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I swam as fast as I could, fighting the burning in my arms and legs. We swam toward the light from James's house, which seemed miles away. The swim felt endless, but fueled by adrenaline, we made it. By the time we pulled ourselves onto James's dock, I thought I might have hypothermia. I've never been that cold in my life. We raced inside, locked every door, and called the police. It took them almost an hour to arrive, which was outrageous. When they finally did, they went straight across the lake to investigate. After a while, they returned and told us what I expected. There was no one there. They confirmed that the house had been abandoned for years, with no signs of recent occupancy, no footprints, no gear, no personal belongings, just an empty house. They weren't pleased with us and lectured us about why we didn't call sooner. James's parents were even angrier when they found out. Let's just say I wasn't invited back to the lake house after that. James told me his parents were threatening to sue the town for allowing something like that to happen and the police for not investigating further. As for me, I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who was in that house or why they set that trap or what they planned to do if we hadn't run. I really don't want to think about it. Most of my friends agree it was a trap and believe that whoever was behind it got cold feet at the last minute. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if they had gone through with their plan. Now, this is a story that is the culmination of years of wonderment and imagination. It's also a warning for those people who have a wild imagination, but sometimes let things go instead of giving into it. That will all make more sense after I tell you the story about the house that sat across the lake from my grandparents' house. I apologize in advance for the long setup. I feel it's important to provide the backstory completely before I tell you what happened. Just recently, my grandpa passed away, and my parents inherited the old lake house that my grandparents lived in for my entire life. I loved that house. My entire family loved that house. Years of fun family memories are filled within the walls of that place. One of the most special memories I have of the house was staying over one night with my cousins. We stayed up all night playing cards and telling ghost stories. We brought over the GameCube and didn't even play because we were having fun doing other things. That night, my cousin Gemma told us about an urban legend that all the people in town believed, and it scared the daylights out of us kids. Gemma was around 16 years old at the time, and we were all probably around 12. To understand Gemma's urban legend story, I have to paint a picture of the area surrounding my grandparents' lake house. The house was mostly secluded. A couple of houses lined the street, but the people mostly kept to themselves. The backyard was probably 30 feet of grass, and then a lake for as far as you could see. The only exception was just on the horizon, a small island, and on that island was a house. Not a little shack either, in fact. It was a decently sized home. The most noteworthy thing to mention, though, was that the house was always abandoned. For all the years we went up to visit that lake house, the house on the horizon was always empty. There were never lights on, and there were never boats on the property. I was in our family boat several times with my grandpa, and when we got close to the island, there were no trespassing signs all over the place. My grandfather would usually just scare us kids by saying, "Oh yeah, that house is haunted. Just don't mess with it, you'll be fine." Then he would laugh and continue smoking his signature cigar. Now that you can hopefully visualize the little island, I'll sum up the story that Gemma told us that evening. This is as close to verbatim as I remember from Gemma's story. She said, "So you guys know the house across the lake? Well, Grandpa is right. It is haunted. If you get close enough to the house after midnight, you can hear the wails and screams of the victims who died there. Nobody knew the guy's name or where he came from, but he would abduct his victims from town and bring them to the house, never to be seen again. Then one day, the murders just stopped. The townspeople didn't know what happened to him. Some say he got caught, some say he fled and is still out there. Some even say he still lives there and remained there for the rest of his life. But some, like myself, know the truth. The spirits of his victims rose from the dead and claimed his soul. Now his murderous, vengeful spirit haunts the house, and if you get close enough after midnight." And she screamed as loud as she could to scare us kids, laughing as we all jumped out of our skin. Some of my younger cousins were crying, but not me. I was beyond intrigued, and that story sent me on a course of wonderment for the rest of my days at that lake house. The reason why I remember that night so vividly was because that story changed my life. I know that sounds ridiculous, that a simple, impossible story can change my life, but it really did. A story opened my eyes to horror. Afterward, I became a lifelong horror lover. What came out of listening to that story was my fascination with the house across the lake. My cousins soon forgot about the story, but I became obsessed with the house, so obsessed that it crossed into creepy territory. I bought binoculars, and when we visited the lake house, I would bring them along to study as many details of the island house as I could. I am a decent artist, and that house became my main subject. I would draw and sketch all sorts of wild abominations and other dark entities emanating from the home. Whenever I would bring up taking the boat to the island or anything in that arena of conversation, I would immediately get shut down by either my dad or grandfather. In recent years, I stopped trying to go to the island and honestly lost interest. I was always intrigued by the house, but wasn't obsessed anymore. The final summer that my grandfather was alive, we had a cookout at the house. That evening, when we were all sitting around drinking and having fun, for the first time in my entire life, I saw a light coming from the house across the lake. I jumped up, and suddenly my love for the house was reignited. Was someone finally in the house? Was it the spirits, like Gemma claimed all those years ago? I tried to get someone who could drive the boat to take me out there, but no one would give in. Everyone had been drinking, and it was dark on the lake. Nobody wanted to take that risk for something so stupid. My dad said that whoever owns the place was probably just visiting and told me to calm down and hang out like everyone else. Fast forward to just recently when my grandpa passed away. As I stated earlier, my dad got the house in the will. Once the warmer months came, we went to the lake house to start cleaning it out and renovating. My parents planned on moving there and selling me their home in town. All the years of going to the lake house, I never had my boating license and never even attempted to drive the boat. This past summer, I changed that. I was determined to scope out that island. One night after painting all day, my parents went back to town for the night, and I decided to stay out at the lake with my girlfriend. Luckily, it was a clear night, so the moon was giving off a good amount of light, and I could actually see. However, there was no light coming from the house across the lake. That night, my girlfriend and I got the boat ready and made the extremely short voyage to the island. All the no trespassing signs were still intact, and the house itself looked like it was ready to fall apart at any moment. Surely, it was not safe for someone to live in. I was able to park the boat at a dock that surprised me while still standing. My girlfriend tried to talk me out of looking around the house, but I had to see it for myself. 20 years of curiosity was eating me alive. I looked inside the windows first to make sure that there was truly nobody in there. The house was 100% unlivable. Garbage and debris were everywhere inside. I opened the door, which was surprisingly unlocked. My girlfriend reluctantly got out of the boat and stood in the doorway as I stepped around all the hazards lying around the house. Nothing of note was inside. It was truly just rubble, debris, and some sort of trash. I started to hear creaks in the house. My mind was fluttering with excitement and fear. Could it really be ghosts? That was a thought that admittedly crossed my mind. My logic told me that it was an old house, and old houses make noises, so it probably wasn't ghosts. Although the noises got louder, this didn't sound like any old house I'd ever been in. Something felt wrong. I continued to explore the rooms in the house, and I swear I could hear whispering or breathing. I was completely on edge. I finally entered the last room on the first floor, and the odor was awful. On the floor near the windows was food that had recently been eaten. It was something with sauce or ketchup because it was still saucy and not dried up. There were sleeping bags on the floor of this room, and candles that looked relatively new. I shouted to my girlfriend that we needed to leave right away. I didn't want to take any chances. My shouting, I believe, is what triggered the events that happened next. Two people emerged from the closet of the room I was in. They pushed me to the ground and then shoved my girlfriend as I ran out of the doorway of the house. I got up and chased them, and that's when I got a good look at one of the two. One of the mystery people, I believe, was a woman based on her voice, and they got into our boat. The other one stood on the shaky dock, face to face with me. It was a man who was likely in his 30s. He looked messed up, maybe even on something. His beard was greasy and disgusting, his hair buzzed, and he was covered with boils or something like that. He held out a broken bottle with jagged edges. The man started to slash the air wildly and said, "One more step and I'll do it." Not wanting to test that theory, I let the man go. The two stole our boat and drifted away into the darkness of the night. Thankfully, we had her phone, so we could call my dad and alert the authorities. After a miserable night of giving all the details to the police, they never caught those two squatters. They found my dad's boat several miles down the lake, washed up on the shore of someone's property. Inside the boat, they found the broken bottle I mentioned, a pack of cigarettes, and even a pocket knife. Other than the trauma I still live with, I also got into some legal trouble for trespassing on that property. I guess the signs weren't just for show. When they investigated the house more, they found a rowboat on the backside of the small island. The boat had a massive hole in it, and they assumed this was how the attackers got onto the island and were stuck there because of the hole in the boat. All of this happened this past summer. There are still no signs of these attackers, and I haven't been back to the lake house since. I'll never get the guy's insane face out of my mind. I understand the expression "curiosity killed the cat" more than ever now. In 2015, I lived in a beautiful lake house in my hometown. At the time, it was the first place that my ex-girlfriend and I rented together. The reason we decided on the lake house was not because of the beauty of the home, but because it was the only place we could find that would allow dogs. We had two big dogs, and none of the apartments in my hometown allowed them. The house was most certainly out of both of our price ranges, but we made it work because of the dogs. The house was awesome. It sat right on the lake and had a dock and everything. The inside was nice and fully renovated. It wasn't one of those dirty old camps. The nicest part of the house, though, was just how quiet the street was that we lived on. It was our house and our one neighbor to the left, and that's it for the entire street. The neighbor was a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Elsa, but told us that we could call her Mama Soul. I'm not kidding. She actually told us to call her Mama Soul. This woman was wild. She was about 4'11" and had insanely curly hair and extremely bright green eyes. She was pretty for sure, but in a crazy type of way. Of course, we acted polite when we met her. We smiled and went about our lives after the introduction. The months rolled on, and we had virtually zero interaction with Elsa. A few times we'd see her outside and we'd wave, then just go about our day. She wasn't married and wasn't in a relationship that I could tell. However, we would always see people going in and out of her house. We usually never saw those people come around again. My ex and I would constantly try to figure out what was happening over there. Sometimes people would be in there for 2 minutes, and other times they wouldn't leave until the next day. It was always either 1 or 2 people, never more than 2, and these people were all different ages and races. After months of joking around about it, I finally decided that she was most likely doing something related to religion or self-help. I figured Mama Soul was trying to heal the soul, so to speak. As we approached the end of our lease, something happened. We received a package in our mailbox that was addressed to Elsa. It seemed like a somewhat common mistake, especially given the way our houses sat on the street with the lake in the background. Sometimes the numbers on the houses were messed up. I decided to be nice and bring the package over to Elsa. I knocked on her door, but she didn't answer. I knew she was home because her car was parked in the driveway. I rang the doorbell and knocked a little harder. Then I heard a crash from inside. I coughed into my hands and looked through the window. The house was practically empty. A massive living room greeted me right inside the door, and the only piece of furniture was a couch. Straight ahead, windows revealed the lake in the backyard, and to the right was another door, slightly ajar. I would soon discover that this door led to the basement. As I peered through the window, Elsa suddenly came barging up the stairs from the basement. She looked tense and angry, and I jumped back from the window. Elsa flung open the door and greeted me with a sharp, "Yeah, what do you want?" I froze for a moment. I had never seen Elsa act like this. I extended the package toward her and stammered, "I got your mail. I thought you might want it." She instantly smiled and snatched the package from my hands. As she grabbed it, I noticed her hands were covered in something. I didn't want to think about it then, and I'm having a hard time recalling it now, but it honestly looked like blood. She noticed me looking at her hands, made some erratic noise, and loudly said, "Well, thank you, Han. I'll be seeing you." Then she slammed the door in my face and rushed back into the basement. I walked back home, eager to tell my ex everything that had just happened. She was freaked out, and I didn't blame her. The next night, we had a fire in the backyard. Since our lease was almost up, we wanted to make the most of our time in the lake house. My ex went to bed around 10, and I decided to stay outside a little longer to enjoy the lake. About an hour after she went to bed, I heard a door shut. I turned around to see Elsa walking toward me. I won't lie, I felt uneasy thinking about the day before. She stopped right next to me and sat down in the spot where my ex had been. Looking directly at me, she said, "Sorry about yesterday. I didn't mean to be rude. I was working on a painting for a client and dropped the canvas right before you knocked." I felt frustrated and angry, but I told her not to worry and that I understood. Her explanation did ease my mind. It made sense why her hands were covered in red if she was painting. It also explained why so many people were in and out of her house. As an artist, she was probably being commissioned for various projects. We talked for a while, but soon decided it was time to part ways. As I started to walk in through the back door, Elsa shouted, "Hey, if you ever want to come over, my doors are always unlocked." I just waved and went inside, locking the door behind me. I was pretty sure that Elsa had semi-seduced me, but I didn't want to assume anything. The next day I told my ex about it, and understandably, she wasn't pleased. We only had 2 more days until we moved out, so we decided to let it go. That night, we sat outside again, soaking up the last of the lake's beauty, when we suddenly heard screams coming from inside Elsa's house. We exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. The screams sounded like they were filled with pain. I know it isn't right, but where we came from, we didn't get involved in others' business. In hindsight, we should have called the police, but at that moment, it felt like an exaggeration. My ex convinced me to go over and knock on the door to check if everything was okay. As I approached the door, the loud screams sent chills down my spine. Whoever was screaming sounded like they were in incredible pain. I knocked hard, and the screaming stopped. I waited for a moment, and then Elsa emerged from the basement. Once again, she was covered in that red paint she had mentioned before. This time, she didn't open the door. She came over to the window and shouted through the glass, "Sorry, this isn't a good time. I have someone over. We'll talk tomorrow." She then turned around and slammed the basement door. I hurried back to my ex and told her we should go inside and lock the doors. The next morning, as we started moving, I saw Elsa waving to me from her front steps. I waved back, but didn't want anything to do with her anymore. I never reported what I heard, and I never checked back at her house either. I hoped she was just covered in red paint. As for the screams, I still have no idea. I hope she was just into some weird things, but not anything violent. Now that I'm older, I would definitely call the cops. To anyone younger reading this, if you hear screaming and someone sounds like they're in trouble, chances are they probably are. You could be the difference between life and death. Back in the early 2000s, before Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist was where all the action took place. I don't recall the exact year that this story took place. I just know it was in the early 2000s time frame. I was tired of living in my parents' house and was ready to move into my own place. Unfortunately, like many young people who don't come from a lot of money, I didn't have much capital to my name, and my credit was horrible. So getting an apartment was not easy. In fact, it was almost impossible. After constant rejections due to my poor credit, I was recommended to Craigslist by a work friend. He told me that you could find anything you were looking for, even places to rent. That night, I found a ton of places to rent. What I found great about a lot of these places was that they didn't require a single credit check, and most were even month to month. That style of renting was perfect for someone in my financial situation. I narrowed down my search until I was left with one place that I was absolutely in love with. It was a beautiful house located right on the lake. My hometown is beautiful and is home to dozens of lakes and rivers that run through the state. The pictures made this place look like a resort, not even an actual place to just live. The listing itself was almost too good to be true. The guy, whose name was Randy, seemed like a great guy and extremely flexible. Throughout the post, he constantly said things like, "Rent is $850, but if you're tight 1 month, we can work it out some way." Or in other sections, he would say, "Always looking for help around the house, would be willing to lower rent for assistance." I instantly emailed Randy and heard back several hours later. He laid out even more information in the email and told me to come meet him at the house tomorrow evening at about 9 p.m. I'm not sure why I didn't even notice how weird that late meetup time was. I think at that moment, I was just excited about the prospect of moving to this lake sanctuary. When I read through all of this, I assumed the guy was older, or maybe just a genuine person who knows money can be tight sometimes. What I would soon find out was that Randy would not be the same man from the posting. Randy was something much worse. The next night came, and I drove out to the lake house at about 9 p.m., as Randy wanted, and I was blown away by how much more beautiful the place was in person. It was one of those nights when the moon was so bright that it almost looked like it was a cloudy day outside. As I drove down the long driveway, one thing I noticed was that he had virtually no neighbors. The closest house I saw was nearly a mile down the road. Being in my early 20s, all I could think about at this moment was the parties that I could have without disturbing the neighbors. I approached the door slowly so I could take in all my surroundings. I could see the lake glistening in the moonlight behind the house. It truly was a beautiful place. Finally, snapping back to reality, I knocked on the door, and a middle-aged, chubby man answered the door in a robe. He was bald and had a very well-trimmed goatee. We both just kind of stared at each other for a moment. I was taken out of my element by the fact that this guy was wearing a robe. Finally, in an annoyed voice, the man said, "Can I help you, or are you just going to stand there?" I can only imagine the look I was giving the man. I said, with some hesitation in my voice, "Yeah, are you Randy?" I was supposed to be meeting Randy about renting the house. The man cocked his head back and groaned, almost like he was in pain, and said, "Is this a joke?" I didn't know at all what he was talking about. I feared for a moment that I may have had the wrong house, and as I pulled out my phone for clarification of the address, I finally found out what the misunderstanding was. The man looked over my shoulder at my car and said, "Is Kim in the car, or is she meeting you here?" I laughed with a tone of irony in my voice and said, "Dude, that's my name, I'm Kim." Randy looked like he was going to explode with anger. I know people think that Kim is a woman's name, and those people are mostly correct. I have only met one other male Kim in my entire life. It's something that I was constantly made fun of in school, but it's something I've learned to overcome, and I don't even realize it anymore. Randy, on the other hand, was expecting a woman named Kim, not a big old country guy. Instead of letting me in or talking, he just continued to huff and puff in the doorway, and finally I spoke up. "Hey man, are you gonna show me the house?" Before I could finish my sentence, the man pushed me off his front steps. Since I wasn't prepared for that at all, I didn't brace myself and fell right back. I jumped to my feet quickly, and Randy stood in the doorway shouting. I was so confused. Was this man mad that it was a guy and not a girl? That push was enough for me, and I decided that I was just going to get out of there. Even though the place was like something out of a movie, I didn't want this freak to be my landlord. I grabbed the car door and started to make a string of poor choices, starting with insulting the man for what he was wearing. I looked right at him and said, "You know what? Why would you answer the door in a robe anyway? If I was a woman, God, that would be freaking weird. No woman would ever want you to be their landlord anyway." Still outraged by the fact that I wasn't a woman, the man shouted, "I'm looking for a roommate. This is my home. No men are allowed other than me." I got into my car, just shaking my head in disbelief. As I shut the door, the man ran toward my car and started to bang on the car door. I could clearly see the man's chest hair popping out of his robe. At this point, I was just done engaging with him, and while I was trying to turn around in the driveway, he kept yelling, "I had plans for the real Kim, not you. The real Kim." I didn't even want to think about what that meant. A few weeks later, my friends and I had a laugh about the entire thing, not for a second realizing just how strange and potentially dangerous this was. This man was expecting a young 20-something-year-old woman named Kim at 9 o'clock at night and was planning to greet this woman in a robe. Once my friends and I realized how messed up this was, we decided we were going to try and find out some information about this guy. At this point, the listing was removed and the email address was no longer valid. We even went as far as to drive out to the lake house to see if Randy was there, and surprisingly, he wasn't. It was a family with no Randy in sight. The theory started to penetrate our minds. Was this even a real listing? A friend's dad worked with the police, and we mentioned the entire situation to him. He seemed unresponsive, as if there was nothing he could do since there wasn't any concrete evidence that anything malicious was going on. He can't arrest someone for wearing a robe. A year later, I went back to the lake house one more time in the middle of the day. I knocked on the door and was greeted by a pleasant woman named Lila. I asked if she owned the house or rented it and if she knew anyone named Randy. She explained to me that she owned the house and had never heard of the name Randy. I explained the entire story to Lila, who was horrified and sick to her stomach about what I had just told her. She hoped that I was pranking her, but unfortunately, I wasn't. The night I met Randy, Leela and her family were in Florida for a family reunion. The house was unattended, and they weren't supposed to have anyone watching it either. Obviously, we reported the situation for real this time, and I never heard anything about it again. I never reached back out to Lila after I gave the police all my information, and I never heard from the police either. I have no idea who Randy is, and most importantly, I have no idea what Randy intended on doing that evening. It makes me sick to think about it, and I can only hope that whoever Randy is, he's locked up somewhere tight and never gets out. For the first time in my life, I'm happy to be a boy named Kim. When I was in high school, my basketball team took a trip to Florida. We had qualified for some tournament down there. I was more excited about the trip to Florida since we were from Tennessee, and where I'm from, there aren't very many amazing bodies of water, just a few smaller lakes, but nothing like the ocean. When we got down there, I was amazed by the view from the back deck of the house our team was renting. We were staying right on the Gulf Coast. I'm still in love with the view from that house, to be honest. Our first night down there, we didn't do anything. We watched some basketball on TV, and then the coach made us go to bed at around 10 p.m. Each room in the house had 4 kids, and the 2 coaches each had a room. Shortly after midnight, my room decided to sneak out, not to do anything too crazy. We just wanted to go to the beach after dark. It was so easy since our room faced the bay and was on the ground level. So we all jumped out the window and quietly snuck to the beach. We figured since the beach was about 20 yards from the house, we might actually wake the coaches. So instead, we walked further down the beach to avoid being near our house. We hung out down there for roughly an hour and decided that we should probably head back since we had to wake up at 7 a.m. Instead of walking on the beach and then heading straight into our open window, we decided to walk up the road. For some reason, we thought it would be quieter and we would have less chance of being noticed, just in case one of our coaches looked out the back window. We made our way back down the road, passing by other beautiful waterfront properties. I was surprised by just how far down we walked. Our house was still at least 10 houses away. A few houses down was one I saw on the street. It had a lot going on outside. There were tons of plants, knickknacks, and a disturbing number of lawn gnomes. One of my friends picked up one of the lawn gnomes and held it next to his face, saying, "How creepy is this thing? Why would anybody own this?" We all laughed because he was right. It wasn't just a normal lawn gnome. It was like a gnome in a bikini, posing like a model. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen. We didn't want to linger, so we put it down and hurried back. We got inside undetected, and the rest of the night went by without any issues. We woke up at 7 a.m. and got ready for our morning slate of games. We arrived at the venue, which was an outdoor basketball court. It was nicer than most gyms I had played in. While we were warming up, I noticed a strange little man standing under our basket. It didn't alarm anyone else. He wasn't directly on the court or anything like that. Around the perimeter of the court were guardrails, so spectators couldn't just wander onto the court. But something was off about this guy. Even standing behind the rails, he was just standing there, staring at my friend, the same friend who had picked up the gnome the night before. I watched as my buddy warmed up and moved around the court, and this guy's eyes just followed him wherever he went. I kept it to myself because honestly I was just so focused on the game. We actually won our game, and as we celebrated the victory on the court, the man walked around the guardrails and approached our huddle. Our coach was in the middle of a pep talk and was thrown off by this man just standing right outside our huddle. Our coach stopped his talk, but the guy said, "Hey, you lost something." The man said nothing and just stared at my buddy. After a few seconds of horrible awkwardness, the man finally said in a quiet but angry-sounding voice, "Where is it? I want it back." Half of my teammates laughed, and the other half just stood there in confusion. My assistant coach went over to the man and walked him out of our huddle. The man didn't seem to put up any resistance and just kept looking back. It was strange and uncomfortable, but we moved on with our lives and went back to the house. When we got back to the beach house, we spent a bunch of time on the beach, ate dinner, and just hung out. We didn't have a game the next day until 3 in the afternoon, so our coach told us that we could stay up a little later that night. The coach told us to get in bed around midnight and just not leave the property. Simple rules that I wish we would have obeyed. I'm not sure exactly what time it was, but after the coaches went to bed, we decided to sneak back to the beach. This time, it was a group of 8 of us instead of 4. We got down there and did the same thing as the night before. We traveled down the beach several yards so we weren't in sight. About 20 minutes after getting down there, we were approached by the same guy from the game. He walked right by all of us, went straight up to my buddy and said, "Where is it?" My buddy just looked at him and then turned around to ignore him. Without hesitation, the little man screamed, "Hey, I won't ask nicely again." My buddy turned around and, in an arrogant voice, said, "I don't know what you want, man. Sorry." Then he shrugged and laughed, looking at us. My teammates down on the beach laughed as well, and we tried to start walking away from the guy, but he kept following us. Then my buddy made his next big mistake. He turned around and punched the guy right in the face, causing him to fall over. Rather than make sure that he was okay, we all just ran as fast as we could. Once we got inside, we shut the lights off and locked all the doors. We were scared that this guy knew where we were staying and that he would show up at our door. Luckily, about an hour went by, and we didn't see him. We all shook off the excitement and decided to turn in for the night. At some point during the night, my buddy woke me up. He told me that somebody was in the house. I told him it was probably one of the coaches and to just go back to sleep. He insisted that whoever was out there kept walking by the door and mumbling to themselves. He thought maybe he was just being paranoid, so he locked the bedroom door. After locking the door, he said whoever was out there kept trying to open it every few minutes. I woke up everyone else in the room and we quietly discussed every possibility that it could be. Before we knew it, all the sounds had gone away. Maybe it was our coach, but that wouldn't explain why they kept trying to open our door. If our coach wanted to get in, he would pound on the door until we opened it. During our quiet deliberation, one of the other teammates shouted and pointed to the window. It was the man from the beach standing there. We had never locked the windows, and the man jostled the window and eventually got it to open. Without remorse, he started to climb into the window. Our first instinct was to hit the guy, but as soon as he got in, he started to wave a knife around. We all backed away with our hands up, not knowing if we should scream or charge the guy. He was small, but he was holding a knife. One of us could get seriously hurt if we made the wrong move. One last time, the man said, "Where is she?" This must have been loud enough because our coach started to knock on the door and ask if we were okay. Thinking quickly, we unlocked the door and ran out of the room as fast as we could. My coach yelled at the man as soon as he saw him. The man chased us to the side of the room and jumped on my buddy. Instead of stabbing him, he bit his neck. He literally bit him on the neck like he thought he was a vampire or something. The coach tackled him to the ground and detained him for a while, and before long he had the police there, who thankfully arrested the guy. Our coaches handled all the police interactions, except when they asked us a few questions, and we told them everything we could think of. Well, in case you haven't figured it out, this was the guy who lived in the house with the gnomes. According to the officer, the man claimed that we took it. We told the officer that we threw it back on the ground right after we picked it up. My buddy swore up and down that that's what happened. After a horrible couple of days left in Florida, we headed back to Tennessee with a story that most people truly wouldn't believe. The worst part of the entire story was when we got home in the locker room before practice. My buddy gathered us all around and said, "Yo, check this out. I brought the gnome back." Nobody found it amusing. They almost died because this idiot took this guy's lawn decoration. He told the police we didn't have it, which I thought was the truth. We told him to get rid of the gnome and not ever talk about it again. After graduating, I didn't see that teammate for years. The reason I'm writing this now is that when I was visiting home for the holidays, I ran into him at the bar, and the first thing he told me was, "Yo man, guess what? I still have that gnome in my bedroom." Crazy, right? I shook my head and left the bar that night. Honestly, I hope I never see him or that stupid gnome ever again. Is it possible that some people are just cursed? I try not to dwell on all the horrible events in my past, but it's hard sometimes. It seems like every time I get my life on an upward trajectory, something terrible happens. If curses are real, then I swear I'm cursed. Many years ago, I had struggles in my life. You name it, I have been there. I've done countless things that I'm not proud of, and I still pay the consequences of those things today. I'm 42 years old now. For some context, and 6 years ago, I was finishing a short stint behind bars. While locked up, I met a guy named Dre, who just happened to be a doctor. As ironic as that may be, he was a doctor of psychology, though his real name was Andre. He went by Dre to be more approachable. He used the name Dr. Dre as a new talking point every time he would meet someone new when he came to visit us in the jail. Talking with Dre helped me to overcome tons of my mental demons. I used to blame everyone else for my errors, never taking responsibility for my actions. When I was released from jail, I stayed in touch with Dre. He helped me in more ways than I can count. Perhaps the most important thing Dre helped me to accomplish was starting my self-help group. That first year after I was released, I started to preach about love, peace, and just being an overall better human. I used my struggles in the past as a tool and talking point. Dre would often come to my presentations, and once or twice, he even said a few words. I started to preach in parks in front of nobody, except the people passing through, and by the end of the year, I was scheduled to speak in front of actual crowds. It seemed like my life was finally being pulled in the right direction. I'm not sure if all these people that preach this stuff mean what they say or if they do it for the publicity, but I believe the main reason I became so popular so fast was that I meant every word I said. The folks that listened to me could feel my emotion and truth when I spoke. I truly wanted people to love their neighbors and grow as a community and ultimately as people. After consulting with Dre and receiving some funds from him, I decided to hold my first retreat. I rented out a beautiful location that sat upon a crystal blue lake. It was a mansion, for lack of a better word. I planned to hold a retreat at this beautiful lake house getaway to preach about empowerment and accomplishing your goals. I had speeches and all types of activities planned. To give you an idea of how gigantic this house was, I had 36 people coming to the retreat, and the house could sleep about 40 people. So why am I cursed? Well, the retreat was to be held on Saturday. People would show up on Saturday afternoon, stay overnight, and on Sunday we would have breakfast as a community and then leave. On Friday, I decided to go up to the house with Dre and my fiance. I wanted to scope out the area, see where I could do outdoor activities if possible, and just get a night to prepare for the retreat. The house was even more magnificent than I imagined. It looked like an old Disney castle or something like that. 3 of us checked the place out and decided to turn in early for bed. In the middle of the night, I heard screaming. It was faint, but it was definitely the sound of screams. I nudged my fiancée and asked if she heard anything. She was groggy but could hear the faint screams. I opened the door and made my way through the dark house. The screams seemed to be coming from down the hall. It was Dre's room. I ran back to our bedroom and told my fiancée that Dre must have been having a nightmare or something, and that I was going to check in on him just to make sure he was all right. With no urgency in my pace, I walked to his room. As I opened the door, I couldn't believe what I saw. Dre was blindfolded and sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. He looked beaten, and there were 3 other men in the room. When I opened the door, 2 of the men lunged at me and held me down. They covered my mouth so I couldn't speak or scream, and they shut the door so Dre's screams wouldn't alert my fiancée. The men were masked, so I couldn't make out any details about them. The man holding me to the ground had bright blue eyes, and that wasn't the only detail I could really make out. It sounded like Dre was gasping for air, and in a pleading tone, he said, "Please don't do this anymore. I'm so sorry. I'll tell you anything you want to know." I could barely process what was happening. Then Dre uttered something that made me want to cry. He said my name, my full name, and begged me to stop. The man who had just punched Dre deepened his voice and told him no. Whoever these men were, they were impersonating me. I tried to break free, grunting and making any noise I could, but it was no use. Dre just thought it was me and my accomplices, and he must have believed there was someone else there. After a few minutes of this living nightmare, my fiancée investigated and opened the door. Before the men could react, she turned and ran, screaming. She ran back to our room and slammed the door, calling the police as soon as she was safely locked in the room. The men must have thought the best play at this point was to run, so all three men jumped out of the window of Dre's room and fled. I got up off the ground, and knowing that my fiancé was safe for the moment, I decided to help Dre. When I removed his blindfold, he screamed and tackled me to the ground. He ran out of the house, yelling for help. The cops showed up much quicker than I could have expected, and Dre told the cops that I had assaulted him and that I was still inside. The cops then arrested me, and through all the confusion, I was trying to plead my case. But in the cops' defense, they were just doing their job. After getting my lawyer and the incredible eyewitness account from my fiancé, I was eventually cleared of all the charges. Unfortunately, Dre wasn't convinced, and even to this day, he is convinced that I had some part to play in this attack. Several months after that, one of the attackers actually turned himself in. It was the man with the blue eyes, and he was one of the people who were going to attend my retreat the next day. He never gave me or the police a reason why he attacked Dre and impersonated me. He also has never ratted out on his accomplices either. Fortunately for me, he did cooperate with my story, but it didn't matter. I never recovered from this ordeal. People would never feel safe around me. If this happened to me once, it could happen to me again. At least that's what people think. Dr. Andre still thinks I had something to do with the attack. He is convinced I staged this entire elaborate setup to rob him of his wealth. For the first time in my life, I had something great going, but unfortunately for me, that dark cloud seems to have a permanent spot above my head. Did you enjoy this content? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Support us with a like and subscribe so our channel can reach more people. Thanks for watching until the end.